One of the most renowned artists who got her start and ultimately ended up coming back to Colorado Springs was Laura Gilpin, who looks back to her childhood, remembers riding around with General Palmer, who was showing her all of the trees and plants and identifying them for her. It was one of her fondest memories. One of the earliest books that she remembers giving a lot of attention to was a book that he had given her on photographing wildlife. I think it was called something like Hunting Wildlife with Your Camera. And it really got her started on a path to becoming one of the most renowned photographers in American history, a photographer that Ansel Adams referred to as the first lady of the lens.
Laura Gilpin is a great example of a Western artist. She was born outside of Colorado Springs in 1891, and like Ansel Adams, who was born in the West, she was able to capture something unique about the Western spirit and the Western landscape. Unlike earlier photographers like William Henry Jackson, who focused on the West as an unlimited potential for growth and development, waiting to be exploited by railroads or town companies, Laura Gilpin had a sympathetic view of the West, an intimate view of the West, because of growing up here in the Pikes Peak region. And she captured the communication or the link between the landscape and the people who occupied it. Because her parents wanted her to have the finest education, she was sent to boarding school at the age of 14. She returned in 1909, and her first photograph was actually published in 1916 in a photography magazine. In 1917, she went to New York and studied under the well-known pictorial photographer Clarence White. What's interesting about Clarence White and her training there is that he was a major part of the school of pictorialism. Just like today, in the early 20th century, photography was being debated. Was it an art form, or was it simply a photomechanical reproduction process? And photographers like Clarence White, he strived to differentiate his artistic photography from just documentary photography by using innovative techniques like soft focus lenses and platinum prints. And the training that Laura received there directly influenced how she took photographs and how she interpreted nature through her photography. Pictorial artists really wanted to show the public or the viewer that this photograph, no matter what the subject, was a work of art, that it was thoughtful, that it was precisely worked, that it was specific. It wasn't random or documentary in any way. After her training, Laura returned to Colorado Springs in 1917 and opened up a commercial studio. And even though over time she moved away from the exclusive use of soft focus and platinum prints, she always stuck to black and white. And some of her most beautiful works, I believe, are her platinum prints. She tended to avoid using color photography because she found it too literal. What is most interesting about Laura Gilpin to me is that she was so dedicated to her craft. She was a tireless photographer. She would spend an inordinate amount of time out in the field, and she would not limit her exposure. She would take exposure after exposure after exposure to try to get the scene just right. She would camp out for days in less than hospitable conditions. She would drive off into the far reaches of the state to try to capture a particular image at a particular time. So she had this incredible work ethic. She really worked to shape her photographs, and she was quite successful. In the 1920s, she took a trip to Europe, and she to study the historic culture and nature of European society. And interestingly enough, it was as a result of this trip that she began to get more interested in the history of her own backyard, of the Pikes Peak region, and then later the Southwest. After she got back from Europe, she took her first trip to Mesa Verde in 24 and 25, and she started photographing Mesa Verde. And again, this relationship between nature and the people who live there. She went on to publish her first book on Mesa Verde in 1927. She also worked on projects like the Rio Grande River and Canyon de Chelly. Her most famous work, perhaps, is on the Navajo. She eventually published a book called Enduring Navajo. And she's very well known for her sympathetic, intimate glimpses into the lives of people who live in the Southwest, live in it and around it, and how they are influenced by their environment.
She wasn't just an aesthetic artist who had a good eye for photography. She also went beyond that into the other, to the left side of the brain, photography, and dealing with technique and materials and the scientific, technological aspects. But she did have a remarkable eye for composition and lighting.
When she was working on her Rio Grande book after World War II, where she briefly worked for the Boeing company for the war effort, she began visiting the Rio Grande River and taking photographs of it and the people around it. And she talked about the people being ephemeral, but the river always flowing. You know, the people will come and go, but the Rio Grande will flow on. And she was able to just capture images that were seemingly mundane, but with her eye and with her technique, she created just things that were beautiful, surprising, and really made you want to visit or to see these things for yourself.
You know, it's interesting that in photography, there are many more well-established and accomplished and recognized women than perhaps in any other fine art that you can think of. The women really took on photography when you think of Dorothea Lange and Imogen Cunningham and Diane Arbus. I think Laura Gilpin is right up there with them.
Because of her incredible work ethic, she mentored a number of students. She did eventually teach at the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center. And she was working on her last project on Canyon de Chelly in her 80s. She died in 1979 at the age of 88. And her work is in major museum collections across the country. Historian and curator Martha Sandweiss has written a number of exemplary works on how Laura Gilpin helped shape the vision of the West, the vision of photography, and how landscape and people interact. You never get tired of looking at a Laura Gilpin photograph.